Good morning, May 17th. A little side note, if you're watching closely every week, I think you can see my hair growing. I don't think I have to worry about the barber anytime soon, but it's kind of interesting to see how my hair progresses. All right, back to serious business. We're in the middle of Daniel, and as we mentioned, there are four major visions at the end of Daniel, beginning with chapter 7. And with chapter 10, we're going to see chapters 10 through 12, the final vision. And as we look at the screen here in a moment, we'll look at an outline of what the text is about. We're going to see that what you find in the book of Daniel, chapters 10 through 12, is what you're going to find is an introduction to the vision that we'll look at today in chapter 10. And then chapters 11 and the first part of chapter 12 deal with the vision itself with a little bit more detail. And then there's a conclusion at the end of chapter 12 that brings it all to an end for us. Today's lesson is going to be entitled The Power of Prayer. You'll recognize that last week it was about the prayer of confession of Daniel in chapter 9, as well as the beginning of the 70 days or the 70 weeks. And we didn't talk a lot about the 70 weeks. I chickened out a little bit, if you want to say, and didn't get into a lot of detail there. One of the things I did, though, is indicate that there is messianic overtones there. And whether we're talking about Jesus' first coming or a second or a combination, we can see that there are a couple different levels on which the book of Daniel is operating. And we'll see that again in this lesson particularly, and then in the next two lessons as we conclude, we'll see that as well. But what we're going to see here is in chapter 10, another time where Daniel's praying. Last week, we looked at a lengthy prayer of Daniel. Here, we're only going to hear about the prayer and then the response to the prayer. And the key to the power here is, or the idea that the powerful prayer is in play, is because Daniel receives a response. So as we get ready to look at this, I just want to show you what the outline for the lesson is going to be. We're going to be looking at the setting and introduction. I've been typically calling it setting, but there's more to it than that. This time I'm calling it introduction and setting because you have a double layer of introduction here, or setting. You have the general statement about what's going on in the world, so to speak, Daniel's historical context, and then we're going to see a more narrow definition or understanding of that background and setting, dealing with Daniel and what he's doing specifically. We'll look at that. But what we're going to see is when this happened and under what specific circumstances this prayer and response happened. And then what we're going to see is that response. Verses 4 through 9, we're going to see the vision of a man. And I put the word man in parentheses or in quotation marks because there's some question about what this man figure is. We'll talk about that. What we're going to find, too, is that as we move forward, there are a number of other players involved in this discussion. And Daniel's the big one. Then there is the man. And then we'll see a couple of other figures coming into play. And that's going to be borne out in the second part of the chapter. We look at Daniel's conversations. And it's very important that we recognize that what we see here is the word conversations. And that is because there are a couple of different items in play here. One from the man, and then from another being. And then there's a reference to a third being, yet still, who is named. We'll talk about him in a moment. But you'll notice that we'll stop at 21a. Something different is going on at the end of chapter 10, and I'll say that at the end. But just know that we're going to look at the very first part of that verse. And if you have your Bibles and you're looking at that, many of your modern translations are going to go ahead and put the last part of chapter 20 or verse 21 into parentheses, and it overlaps with the beginning of lesson or chapter 11. We'll get it all together here. You see the outline then. We'll break it up into three different parts. And as we come back, we'll look at some questions to ask ourselves related to the passage. And then we'll also talk about some things that we can remind ourselves from this text. So let's go ahead and get right into it. We're looking at Daniel chapter 10. And I want to read the first three verses. That'll set the tone for us, as I've always done for you, to read that. And then we'll walk through it. And if anything, one of the things you found as I teach is I think the key to understanding the text to the best that we can is we have to start with slowing down, reading verse by verse, and just taking it all in. A lot of what I've done in my teaching is just walk you through it, make you stop down, think about some of the things that are said there. We have a tendency just to run right through the text real quickly, and a lot of times our misunderstanding comes from slowing down. What slowing down does, however, it also makes us think about a lot of things that are in play, and a lot of questions that are going to be raised, and we'll see that looking at this text. And I know that as we've gone through this book of Daniel, there have been a lot of questions raised, and I know I've not answered them all. I've left you with lots of questions, but hopefully what I've done is I've whet your appetite to go back and look at Daniel. I hope I've whet your appetite to really slow down and read what God's word has to say so that we can ponder it all. There's so much in here. Daniel chapter 10, verses 1 to 3. In the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a revelation was given to Daniel, who is also called Belteshazzar. Its message was true, and it concerned a great war. The understanding of the message came to him in a vision. At that time, I, Daniel, mourned for 3 weeks. I ate no choice food, no meat or wine touched my lips, and I used no lotions at all until the 3 weeks were over. Well, let's stop down and talk a little bit about this. This is our background and our setting. As we said, what we have going on here are 2 different levels. We have the big picture. We have, I'll call it global. It's more, the political background. We have a different king in play. We talked last week about the fact that we were under the rule of Darius. And then this week, we're under Cyrus. Curious enough, what we have here is Daniel's reference to this being the 3rd year of Cyrus. Some might look at Daniel 1:21 and it says, well, he ruled, or he lived and was able to serve through the 1st year of Cyrus. And we talked about the possibility of Darius and Cyrus being the same person. Clearly, though, in chapter 9, Darius is called a Mede. We know that Cyrus was a Persian. And so we do have a little bit of something going on there. I don't think it's a major issue. Again, sometimes there are co-regencies and things like that, and that might be going on here. But there are a couple of other things to think about as you look at the fact that this is the 3rd year of King Cyrus. You'll remember that Cyrus, as the Persian, defeated the Babylonians in 539 BC, and then in 538 BC, Cyrus sent out a decree allowing all Jews who would like to go back to their homeland to do that. They can return to Judah and then reestablish themselves in the capital of Jerusalem. Later on, you'll see the rebuilding of the temple taking place. Then we'll see the rebuilding of the walls taking place. But that doesn't happen right away. You see the first wave of exiles going back under Zerubbabel, and then you'll see more go back later under Ezra, and then Nehemiah will come back and lead. But what that means is, if this is the 3rd year, and if we do like Jewish reckoning does, then we can factor in maybe each part of a year being a full year, knowing that ancient times are a little bit difficult to grasp in terms of their specificity or exactness. We can say that this vision that Daniel has and that he relates to us occurred about 537 or 536 BC. We count 539 as the 1st year, move back from there. If we don't count 539 as the 1st year, then we know we're about 536, maybe 535. Again, there's always some little room for time there. But what does that mean? It means this, that we do know that some of the exiles have gone back. And it raises a question then, when Daniel talks about mourning, what is he mourning? Is he mourning that many haven't gone back? Part of what he's mourning is the vision, but why doesn't he go back? And that's a question that many have. He could have gone back. I mean, he was one of the exiles. He was a young man when he left Jerusalem and made it into Babylonia. And now he's under Persian rule, and he's given the freedom to go back. He doesn't. Many suggest, though, that he's been there so long, he's there in old age, it's just really not feasible for him to move, or it's maybe not desirous for him to move. One thing we know, that in his staying behind, this gives him opportunity to hear from the Lord again. And what we're going to see in these next 3 chapters, 10, 11, and 12, is God still has more to work out and to describe to Daniel. Some of it he can understand, some of it he won't. But we see a number of those things going on. Curious also is you have 2 levels of narration here. You have 3rd-person narration, where Daniel is referred to as Daniel, and then his Babylonian name is given, Belteshazzar. And that's not been given very often. I mean, we see it here, but the only other times we see his name used as Belteshazzar is at the very beginning of the book of Daniel, when he's renamed. And then we see it 2 more times in chapter 4 and again later in chapter 5. But this is the only time that we see him called Belteshazzar in the text. And it's always curious as to what's going on there. Clearly, we have a narrator piecing together a number of memoirs from Daniel. I think another thing to think about is the fact that many of the visions that Daniel has had, he's been told to keep them under wraps, to put them in a book and seal them for another time. And as I've said the last couple of lessons, the fact that we're reading right now means they've been opened up, at least opened up in the sense that we can read them. Maybe not opened up in the sense that we understand their interpretation clearly and fully. And we'll run into the same kinds of things coming into this lesson. But then he comes back and we see that it's a first-person narrative. But what's going on? We see a couple of things here. One of the things we see in the text is that this vision, this revelation that he has, he's told that it's true. We know that it is true. The word says we know that the revelation or the message is true, and it concerns a great war. One of the things you're going to see here is the reference to the confirmation of the truthfulness of this revelation. We saw that same kind of language at the end of chapter 8 when that vision was given, and we're told that that one is true as well, verse 8 or chapter 8, verse 26. But the other thing that comes into play here, and it's a little bit more difficult for us to figure out, again, we can probably take a two-tiered approach here, is the fact that there's a reference to the Great War. There was a great war. What's going to be taking place? We saw some things going on in the interbiblical period in earlier visions. I think when we look at chapter 11 and 12, there are going to be some things in there that are so clear that we can't help but to match them up with what took place during the interbiblical period. But one of the key themes of this lesson, the key themes of this chapter, and a little bit difficult for us to grasp sometimes, is the fact that there are also two layers of reality. We'll talk about that in a moment. But there's a great war that's going to occur. Daniel has received this vision, and now he's reacting to the vision, and he's going to be praying, and we'll see that coming up in the reaction to that. What is concerned, of course, is the message or the understanding of the message of the revelation came to him in a vision. So we have a revelation that's given to him, and the meaning and understanding of it's going to come in a vision. What we're going to see then in chapter 10 is an introduction to that vision. We're not seeing the actual vision yet, but we're seeing some things that are taking place behind the scenes from the time Daniel receives the revelation and then will receive the vision. In the interim, what conversations are taking place leading up to that. And it shows us what is occurring as Daniel is praying and the result of his prayer. Notice then in verse 2, it says that he mourned for 3 weeks. Now, we talked last week about the fact that he had mourned, and I didn't spend any time on it. I read the passage where he put sackcloth and ashes on and then went about praying. But that sackcloth and ashes, again, that's emblematic of the mourning process. Here, what we see Daniel do in expressing his mourning is that he goes on a fast. And the things that he gives up are the things of comfort. He doesn't eat the choice food. He says no meat or wine touches his lips. And it also says that he did not partake in putting any lotions on. And you think, well, what's the big deal about lotions? Well, in a dry climate like that, one of the things that people would often do is put lotions on just to kind of give soothness, some moisture to their skin. A lot of times that moisture also, when the wind would blow, would be cooling, just like perspiration. We see a couple of references to this idea of lotions in previous parts of the Old Testament. We see it in 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 20, when Daniel puts on lotion after the time of his mourning, the death of the child born to him in Bathsheba. And then later, we see during Absalom's rebellion, Joab sends a woman to David, and he tells the woman to put on these lotions and perfumes. And then she is going basically as a precursor to Absalom's return to David and the hopeful reunion there. But what we see then is this idea of him giving up all these comforts. What concerns him in this revelation leads him to pray and mourn and fast for 3 weeks. That's going to be a very important topic here in a moment. But he does this over 3 weeks. He says, until the 3 weeks were over. In a moment, we're going to see a very specific time reference that we've not seen before. But we notice here, whatever Daniel sees, he is concerned about, and he goes to prayer. So we have prayer of confession in chapter 9. Here, we have a prayer of mourning. We're not told what the prayer is, but we are told that he goes into a posture of prayer and fasting for this time period. Well, what you're going to then see in verses 4 through 9 is a particular time period when there's a response to his prayer, and a specific individual is going to appear to him. Verses 4 to 9, let me read those and then we'll come back. Just as a reminder, this section that I've called it is the vision of a man, putting the word man in parentheses. On the 24th day of the first month, as I was standing on the bank of the great river Tigris, I looked up, and there before me was a man dressed in linen, with a belt of fine gold from Uphaz around his waist. His body was like topaz, his face like lightning, his eyes like flaming torches, his arms and legs like the gleam of burnished bronze, and his voice like the sound of a multitude. Verse 7, Daniel refers to himself again. I, Daniel, was the only one who saw the vision. Those who were with me did not see it, but such terror overwhelmed them that they fled and hid themselves. So I was left alone, gazing at this great vision. I had no strength left. My face turned deathly pale, and I was helpless. Then I heard him speaking, and as I listened to him, I fell asleep into a deep sleep, falling my face to the ground. Well, let's stop there and pick up a couple of points here. One, we're told a very specific time frame here. It says on the 24th day of the first month. The first month in this calendar would be Nisan. This is March, April. This is exactly around the time shortly after Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. What we have is that Passover would begin on 14th Nisan. The Feast of Unleavened Bread, to combine with that, would end on the 21st of Nisan. So what we have here is Daniel mourning around the time of Passover. Now, again, we don't know why he doesn't go back to Judah. We know that part of his mourning has to do with what he saw in this great vision, or this vision of a great war. But part of me can't help but to think there's a little bit homesick for whatever memory he would have had of Passover. Maybe, as he's thinking about the time of year coming up, he's thinking about the potential of celebrating Passover again as they are rebuilding all that they need to in the homeland. I don't know. I do think, though, that we need to take seriously the fact that this is a real person. Daniel has real emotion. We've seen that. We've seen him describe his own emotion through all of this time. But there's a connection here. Passover, unleavened bread, there's this mourning that takes place. I just want us to, like I said, slow down and take all in what's being said here. The other thing we want to look at then is the fact that there's another location given. We had seen in a previous vision, he goes over into the region of Susa, and at least in his vision. Here, it appears that he's actually there on the Tigris. Others are with him. They hear something, they're stunned by it, they're afraid of it, they run from it. But the fact that the Tigris is mentioned, that's almost in the territory of Persia at this point instead of Babylon. And so again, he's transported. Notice what he sees. He sees a man dressed in linen, which is priestly garb, a belt of fine gold around his waist. He's like a man of topaz. That's almost like a gold-like stone. And his face is like lightning, eyes flaming torches, his arms and legs like gleaming burnished bronze. And then his voice, the sound of a multitude. And the question, of course, is, who is this? We'll talk about that here in a second. I think that there are a couple of options here, and I'm going to, for the sake of argument, fall down on one of them and then just proceed. But I want you to see the reaction. After this occurs, after this appearance, Daniel is left alone. He falls down like a dead man to the ground, and others leave. Notice that they're terrorized, it says. They're overwhelmed with terror, and they flee and hide themselves. So he's left alone, Daniel says, to look at the vision. No strength, face turned deathly pale, and he's helpless. We see this kind of reaction many times in the theophany, the appearance of God in the Old Testament. Sometimes we see that as the angel of the Lord, and then it's revealed later that it's God. This is a vision, a very real type vision, not just Daniel in a sleep having a vision, but a real experience here. What you want to see here then is that this is some kind of supernatural being, a person of majesty. And if you read closely enough, and if you're familiar enough with your Old Testament and some of your New Testament, this language sounds very much like what you see describing God in Ezekiel chapter 1. It's similar language to what we find in Revelation 1 describing Jesus. And so we have really, in some respects, God. It's a representation of God. And what we see is Daniel's reaction to this. Uh, we'll talk about this being God here. As we look at the rest of the passage, we're going to find that there's another being that's described as talking to Daniel. And it's very clear that whoever's talking to Daniel next is not this being, the man. He will talk again, but there will be some other being talking to him. We'll talk about who that might be here in a moment. But notice the reaction here again in the presence of this majesty. We see Daniel just falling to the ground. Now he's down, and we're going to see him step by step get up. We're going to see him step by step start to speak. And then what's happening is he is having his prayer heard and answered. There's a response to him. And what you see then in verses, let me get my bearings again. Back in verses 7 through 9, we have the picture of Daniel and his reaction there. Then the person is ready to speak to him in verse 9. He says, "Then I heard him speaking." Now, we're not told what he said. We're just told that he starts to speak. What's particularly important and insightful to us at this point is Daniel's response. As I listened to him, he said, I fell into a deep sleep, my face to the ground. Now, this has already happened prior. Remember in the vision of chapter 8, when Gabriel is speaking to him, Daniel just falls asleep. And again, I don't understand in that kind of situation how that happens. But this is representative of this reaction to the vision. So he falls into a deep sleep and his face is to the ground. And then what we see taking place is this conversation. There are a number of conversations that are going to take place. First, though, notice as I read verses 10 I'll read 10 through 11 first. There are a number of times when Daniel is touched by this being, the man, and then later by another being. Verse 10 says, a hand touched me and set me trembling on my hands and my knees. So he's kind of slowly getting up. It's almost like he got knocked down, and there's an 8 count, and he's trying to get back up, and he finally makes it to his hands and knees. And then this being speaks to him. Verse 11, Daniel, you who are highly esteemed, consider carefully the words I'm about to speak to you, and stand up, for I have now been sent to you. And when he said this to me, I stood up, trembling. So he's touched. He's able to get to his hands and knees, and now he is strong enough that he's up, standing, but trembling. But key in on something that's said here. He's called a man who is highly esteemed. I'm reading the NIV 2011. What you see in a couple of other translations is a phrase like this in the New American Standard, man of high esteem. So pretty similar to what you see in the NIV. And then what you see in the Christian Standard Bible, a man treasured by God. And you're thinking, how do you get highly esteemed and treasured together? Well, Tremper Longman, in his commentary on the book of Daniel, and in a really, really recent book that came out just last week, How to Read Daniel, talks about this word, and it's really a combination of 2 Hebrew words. One is the word man, and then you have a descriptor here. He says that it's the same kind of word that is used in the 10 Commandments, not to covet, but here it's someone who's coveted by God. It says, Longman says, a way to kind of describe this phrase is a highly desired, precious man coveted by God. So clearly what we see here is Daniel has found favor with God. Notice while the exact language is not being used, it's similar how that is being used when we have the appearance to Mary, who is highly favored among women. We see then how precious Daniel is to God. And of course, we have no problem thinking that way. We can see all that Daniel's been doing throughout his life in Babylon, serving the Babylonians, now the Persians. He's seen as precious to them, but notice his real value is in being precious to God. He's a man highly esteemed. But he stands up trembling. And the man who touched him and spoke to him now continues in verses 12 and following. He says, now you need to stand up. I'm about to tell you some things. I've finally been sent to you. Okay, so we have the man, who is, I think, some kind of theophany, a representation of God. And by the way, normally when we've seen images like this in the book of Daniel, I've made a point to put a picture up for you to kind of take the literal view and see what that looks like. And I did look, but as I came to more and more recognize that what's going on here is some kind of theophany without any real specificity, just the majesty of a theophany. I thought I really don't want to diminish for us what is going on with this text by putting up a picture of a man in a robe and so forth. That really, in light of, I don't want to say that I would be violating the second commandment about having no images, but I do think it's valuable not to limit ourselves to thinking in just those terms. For the ancients in that day to see that kind of thing would have expanded and elevated the majesty that they would be thinking about. I don't want us to diminish that. So I'll let you look those up if you want. I'll let you use your imagination. But the point here is what is being symbolized in the image. And in this, we're seeing someone of great, great majesty. And I'm repeating that word on purpose, the majestic person that God is. Verse 10, a hand touched me, then this person spoke to me. He's here in response to his prayer, and he has something to say to Daniel. Verse 12 then says, he continued, do not be afraid, Daniel. Since the first day that you set your mind to gain understanding and to humble yourself before your God, your words were heard, and I have come in response to them. But the prince of the Persian kingdom resisted me 21 days. Then Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me because I was detained there with the king of Persia. Now I have come to explain to you what will happen to your people in the future, for the vision concerns a time yet to come. Well, let's stop there and talk about those verses for a moment. First, the notion of not being afraid. Fear not. And he says, I have been coming to you. When you started to humble yourself and set your mind to understanding, I started my way towards you. Who is this figure talking? It's not the theophany. This is a different figure altogether. Many speculate that this is Gabriel. There's similar language used here that we see in a previous vision where Gabriel appears. He's not named here, but there's a similar role. He's like a messenger who is speaking. And so some would speculate that. In fact, as I mentioned Longman before, in his commentary back in 99, he kind of hedges it a little bit and says it could be Gabriel or whatnot. For the sake of the popular audience in his more recent book, he just says, let's argue it's the theophany, and let's argue that it's Gabriel. And I think that's fine. We'll say a couple things at the very end when we deal with some apocalyptic literature. But notice what we're seeing here taking place. Daniel is being told that when he started to humble himself and pray, he started to, Gabriel or this being started to make his way toward Daniel. Remember that Daniel fasted for 21 days. Notice that this messenger, this angel says, I tried to get to you, but I was opposed by the prince of the Persian kingdom and then was detained, or he resisted me 21 days, the same amount of time that Daniel had been praying and fasting. And then we're told that Michael came to help him and was able to get through. Okay. And then again, detained in Persia by the king of Persia. What I want to hint at right now, we'll talk about more in a moment, is the fact that there's something going on two levels. Our reaction when we see Prince of the Persians or the Persian kingdom is to think of maybe Cyrus. But then again, we think, well, some maintain that this may be the theophany all the way through, but how could a man resist God? Some may say even, how can man resist an angel like this? Some have suggested, and we're going to at least tread lightly on this. I think it's valuable to do so. I think it's legitimate to do so. The idea of prince here is some kind of angelic being, some other force, obviously a force in opposition to God and his plan, but a force nonetheless. Why can I say that? Because when we then see the one who comes to help this angel resist the prince, it's Michael, the prince. And he is called the prince or the chief of princes. So we have to make sure that we're being consistent in the way we're using the language. But that does raise a question. What's going on? Are we talking about the earthly realm or the supernatural realm? And I'm just going to say that what Daniel's dealing with earthly is taking place supernaturally. We're going to see some of the things that take place in the text moving forward is not only an earthly thing that's taking place, but there's a heavenly thing taking place, some kind of supernatural thing. And that's why when we looked at a couple of visions or some visions a couple of weeks ago, it seemed like we could interpret a lot of that just from the historical background. But then when we see some other things taking place, the battle seems to be a cosmic battle. And so it's kind of weaving back and forth between the two. I'm not going to jump into a Frank Peretti type of interpretation and saying everything takes place. It's some kind of battle you face in the real world or in the natural world is taking place specifically in the supernatural world. But I don't want to say that's not totally the case. There are a number of places that we can see that there is that two-layer approach there. But we see then eventually Michael with this other angel were able to resist. And now in verse 14, as he has approached and has, obviously he's made it, he then says to Daniel, I have come to explain to you what will happen. And he says it will happen to your people in the future because it is about a time yet to come. And now, as the angel, be he Gabriel or someone else, Daniel responds in verses 15 and following. We'll read verses 15 to 17. Daniel says, while he was saying this to me, I bowed with my face toward the ground and was speechless. Then one who looked like a man touched my lips, and I opened my mouth and began to speak. I said to the one standing before me, I am overcome with anguish because of the vision, my Lord, and I feel very weak. How can I, your servant, talk with you, my Lord? My strength is gone, and I can hardly breathe. We now have a reintroduction of this man who comes and touches him. So he's responded to the vision of the man, and now in hearing what this angel has said to him about what's going to take place, the vision of the future of his people and the time of yet to come, he became speechless himself, Daniel does, and he falls to the ground. And the one like a man touches him, touches his lips. And I know that when you hear that phrase, you're thinking of what happened in Isaiah's vision when the angel came and touched Isaiah's lips. There it was a different kind of context. There it was about cleansing from sin and purification. Here it's actually to give him the ability to talk. We'll see that here. Think, for instance, the language of Moses prior to the Exodus when he talks about not being able to speak, not being very good at speech. What God says is, I've given man his tongue. So he touches his lips, and then Daniel says he is able to open his mouth, and he begins to speak. And then he says to the one, I am overcome with anguish because of the vision. And he says, how can I even talk to you? He says, I don't have any strength. I can hardly breathe. And then again, the one, verse 18, looked like a man, touched me. This is the third time then he is touched. And it says, and he gave me strength. So he touched him to help him up. He touched him to help him talk. And he touched him to give him his strength. And then these words, do not be afraid, you who are highly esteemed. There's that phrase exactly again as we saw it earlier. And then he says this, peace, be strong now, be strong. And you can't help but to think of language like this given to Joshua before going into the promised land. But you see again, preparation for Daniel. All of this is still introduction to the vision. We've heard about the vision. We are knowing that there's a vision coming. Daniel has seen something. He just hasn't related it to us yet. We see that he's prayed. We see also that there has been some challenge in the request being answered, or at least a response to the prayer. But now in this time, we see these conversations. God appears, maybe Gabriel appears. We know that Michael's there. He doesn't speak at this point, but he's there. This is the first of 4 references of Michael in the Bible. We'll see another reference to him later in this series of visions. But then we have the speaker speak again, verse 19, after he says to not be afraid, but to be at peace, to be strong. Daniel says, when he spoke to me, he says, then I was strengthened. And then I said, speak, my Lord, since you have given me strength. So he's had this very, deep encounter that has weakened him, and we can see his reaction to this theophany of sorts, and he's brought back, and now he's getting ready to receive what the word of the vision is. We see the speechlessness then coming over him. And what takes place? He says, speak. You've come to talk to me. Now speak. And so the being says, Gabriel says, do you know why I have come to you? That's an interesting question, given the fact that he just said why he's come. He says, soon I will return to fight against the prince of Persia. And when I go, the prince of Greece will come. But first I will tell you what is written in the book of truth. Well, a couple of things going on here. We saw the reference to the prince of Persia. Now we're seeing a reference to the prince of Greece. We're seeing there's going to be a battle taking place. For you and me, we think of Persia and Greece, we think of the actual kingdoms. And I do want to say that as we read chapters 11 and 12, there is that going on. But clearly what's going on in the natural realm here is going to be reflected in some way in the supernatural realm as well. We've seen language like this before in earlier visions where it's very clear that we have, remember, the ram and the goat. We had the Persian kingdom being defeated then by the Greek kingdom. That's similar to what's going on here, but there's something else going on more deeply. And I think it brings us back to the realization that when we get to the end of, I think it's chapter 8's vision, where there is a defeat of that ram, that there's still something more supernatural going on. The last thing I'll mention before we go into a time of some reflection here is the fact that Daniel is told that first he is going to hear what is written in the book of truth. And that causes us a little bit of a question mark. What is book of truth? Some translations will just say the writing of truth. Some have suggested that the language in the ancient world had to do with a series of references or a collection that basically said this term meant what God has decreed to occur. Book of Truth is kind of a record, if you will, a history, a record of all history, past, present, and future. I know that when we hear that, some of us are a little bit maybe put off or at least concerned about that because it seems to be too deterministic. And I know that there is language in the Bible that refers to those kinds of things. But probably what's going on here, as we see taking place, as we see has been a major theme in the book of Daniel altogether, God is in control. We know that God is going to win. And though there are still the battles to be fought, there's the challenges to be faced, we do see that in the end, God wins. The people of God are going to be, they're going to be rescued. They're going to be placed in a position of relationship with Him. So what's going on here, while it might, from our perspective, look too deterministic, it's actually a word of hope to those that would be reading this text. Book of Truth is a reference to that, which is a chronicle of things that are going to take place, not in a deterministic way, but in a way of expressing a word of hope. There is the future that God has taken care of. One thing I'd like to say at this point before we conclude is we see here that the Prince of Persia is going to be defeated. And you may think, well, if we're talking about Persia, that might be Cyrus. Why is there such a negative reference here to Cyrus? He's a good king. He's good in the sense that he was critical in allowing the Jews to return. But I want you to think about this. Babylon was critical in the plan of God for Jerusalem and the Jews as well. Remember, Habakkuk cried out to God when he saw the sin of the people of Judah. He says, when are you going to do something? Don't you see your sinful people? And God says, I plan to do something. In fact, Babylon is going to come and take them into exile. And Habakkuk says back to God, wait a minute, they're more evil than your own people. How can you do that? And God says, well, I can, just because I use them as an instrument of mine doesn't mean that I advocate or absolve them of what they do. There will be a time when their own punishment will come. And the fact is that Cyrus, the king of Persia, in defeating the Babylonians is a fulfillment of that prophecy. Well, then why can we speak negatively, or why should we speak negatively of Cyrus? Well, Cyrus was good in being an instrument of God, but that didn't make him good completely. We still see that there is a human institution involved, and we know about human institutions at times having problems. I won't go into any more detail than that. We know that there are good kingdoms and bad kingdoms, but in reality, all human kingdoms in that respect are less than the best. Some of them are even worse. I think we need to be careful not to overemphasize the goodness of Cyrus. We need to keep it sober, especially in light of the context that we see here. So God can use Babylon, a wicked kingdom, to serve his purposes, and he can use Persia to serve his purposes. Neither of them is in any kind of sense a vindication of those people groups. Well, we see this book of truth. And then I do want to tell you that as you look at the end of chapter 10, you'll see the end of verse 21. Many of your translations are going to have the parenthetical reference. And some will say that this is not a really good breaking point. I see that. I agree with that. The temptation is to go on and include verse 1, or at least part of, well, all of verse 1, with what precedes. And in fact, the NIV 2011 I'm looking at does that. But it can also be seen as the end of at the end of verse 21 as a prelude to what's about to take place. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to treat it like that, and we'll talk about that text next week. I can read it to you now, and then you'll understand why there's a challenge here. There is a parenthetical statement then, no one supports me against them except Michael, your prince. Your prince, meaning Daniel's prince, the prince of people. And what I didn't get into a moment ago is the fact that there is ancient literature that suggests, God creating, and then there will be these different nations. Deuteronomy, I believe, let me scroll back down real quick and see if I have the reference there. But there's a reference in the book of Deuteronomy about God setting up different kingdoms and princes over those kingdoms and so forth. I want to say it's Deuteronomy 32. And as I scroll, I'm just struggling to find it directly. Oh, Deuteronomy 32, verses 7 through 9, where God has set boundaries. Something else to think about. But that's why I come back to this phrase where it calls Michael your prince. He's talking about the prince over the people of Israel. And then he says in chapter 11, verse 1, and in the first year of Darius, and there's another thing we have to talk about, the first year of Darius the Mede, I took my stand to support and protect him. What you're going to see then in verses or chapters 10 through chapters 11 and 12 is the playing out of this vision. So let me conclude with a couple of things to think about. There's a whole lot that we could think about. Let me bring up some of those things for us now. Some questions to think about. There are a lot of things. I know that whenever we've done application time, there are a lot of things that we can think about, and I don't cover everything. But I want to think about this for a moment. How do you respond to what you see taking place in the world? Daniel saw a vision of a great war, and it troubled him. He went into a period of mourning. We see that Daniel has lived through a lot, and what has happened always has driven him to prayer. I think what we need to be thinking about is as we look at the world around us, what do we do? How do we respond? On another level, Daniel may be concerned about his own people. Remember, we had the prayer of confession last week when he knew it was getting close to time for the 70 years to be up. So Daniel has a very keen sense of what's going on among his people in the world. How do you respond to what you see God's people doing in the world? How do you respond to what you see happening to God's people in the world? Do you ever question what God has planned to do? We look around the world and we see, well, the Bible says God's doing something, but when I look around, I don't know that he's doing anything. When Daniel prayed, concerned for what he had seen, we are told that in those 3 weeks, there was an attempt to get to him. In fact, just like we heard last week in the prayer of Daniel, that when he started to speak, God started to respond. And here that takes on a more vivid approach when Gabriel, if you will, says, when your words went up, I started my way towards you. Daniel is getting affirmation that God has heard and there is a plan that's in place. And so do we ever question God? Do we ever wonder, okay, God, are you going to do something? You said you're going to do it. Have you, where are you at in the process? And that leads us to some of these reminders. One, God does hear us and he responds to us. We may not always know what that response is going to look like. We may not always be pleased with that response. We know that God is going to respond. The big picture item, of course, is the fact that we know that God is going to respond in accordance to his will, and that will should give us comfort. It doesn't alleviate the fact that there may be some difficult times that we face, but God does hear. And so these last 2 chapters, we've seen Daniel praying and fasting, and he receives a word from God. And I just pray that as we do that, we'll hear a response from God as well. We need to be sensitive to the realm of the supernatural. Uh, I know that when we get into this, it's a little bit difficult to think about. I know I have to press myself a little bit more to be, and when I say appreciative, I mean take it seriously. Even Paul in the letter to the Ephesians talks about the fact that we do not wrestle against flesh and blood. He talks about the wiles of Satan, and how we need to resist. I think we need to take this seriously. Something is going on in this text of a supernatural level. Michael Heiser has written a book, The Unseen Realm, and he gets into a lot of detail. I have the book. I haven't read it. I mean, I just bought it a couple of weeks ago. But he goes into a lot of detail. I know there are going to be some that question his approach and some of his conclusions. But what he's trying to do is go through Scripture and see the references to supernatural reality. Since then, he's also written a book called Angels, and he's recently written a book called Demons. Now, at that point, I don't know at what point you become obsessed with that, but we can't diminish that. We need to take it seriously. There is a supernatural reality, and we need to be aware of that. And Paul reminds us of that we don't wrestle against flesh and blood, but what we do wrestle against is the idea that there are principalities and powers and so forth. There is that, as he's called later, the prince of the power of the air. Ephesians 6, I think, is a good place for us to look. Now, a couple of things that are not on your screen. One of the things that I see God doing here for Daniel is letting him know that there is something coming, that there is a future that the people are going to experience, but God is going to make it through that with them. And I think a fitting word is that Jesus said the same things to his disciples as he got ready to depart this world. He told them about the persecution they were going to face. And one of the last words Jesus says to the disciples before he goes off to pray, that great priestly prayer, he says, "In this world you will have trouble," but he says, "Take heart, I have overcome the world." We know that language suggests it's already occurred, but there's a lot that we have to endure. And lastly, along with that, I hope that we realize that whenever we lose our strength, as Daniel did in this appearance before God, God touched him to strengthen him. The meaning of these words is that we are to be strengthened by them, to work through them, to stay the course, if you will. We know that the theme of Daniel, the goal is that we are comforted and encouraged to go through these difficult times. The last word that I have for us as we get ready to go into these last two chapters, these are words that we could heed in the previous chapters as well. Now that we're going into another chapter with this possibility of a two-tiered reality, Longman comes up with a couple of other things. I first want to say this about reading what we've been reading. When we think about the text and the challenges we face and the interpretation of the text, there's going to be a question of interpretation, obviously. We've offered up some suggestions. Sometimes it's because of the genre of the text, and we are dealing with apocalyptic, and that comes into place. We have to be very, very careful there. Sometimes it's a matter of language and culture, and we deal with that. We've dealt with in the book of Daniel, Hebrew and Aramaic and so forth. The New Testament, we have Greek. So sometimes the challenge that we face in interpreting text is making sure we get the words right, sometimes getting the cultural background right. Here, we've kind of had a mix of all of those. We've dealt with some Hebrew, we've dealt with some cultural issues related to the Book of Truth, we've dealt with the genre issue with the visions and so forth. But we recognize that there are going to be challenges that we face, and that should humble us. And that leads me to my last thing. We should, and I'm going to paraphrase Longman at this point, we need to avoid reading more than we should into a passage. One of his concerns is whenever there's speculation, in trying to answer the question, we just try to feed more information into it. He says, really, the better approach is just to kind of sit back and let the text talk. We need to be careful not to put into the text something that's not there. And I think what happens is when you look at a lot of other interpretations of apocalyptic, they put a lot in there. I don't know that it's necessarily an attempt to deceive, but certainly the better approach would be, if I can use this term, be more conservative in the sense of, be honest about our questioning, be honest about the difficulty of the text, be honest about what symbols can really be interpreted a certain way, but always don't, avoid putting more into the text than is warranted there. Well, we're going to be going into an interesting time here in the next couple of weeks, looking at this last set of visions in chapters 11 and 12. I hope that you're encouraged. I hope that with each lesson you see God is in control. Daniel is a real person who's going through emotions, facing what he's seeing. But each time there is a word of strength. The next two chapters are going to be heavy into these visions and the various symbols in battle. And I want to take those carefully and slowly. Know that God is in control. Know that he hears and responds to our prayers, and that he is going to win the battle in the end. Daniel receives that word, and I know that we need to receive that word as well. I hope that you'll be ready for worship here shortly. Look forward to seeing you again. As always, I thank you for listening in. And if you want to check with me and ask me any questions, or just say hello, that'd be great too. I really miss you guys and look forward to when we'll be able to be together again. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for being God. We thank you that you are majestic and that you are you inspire awe in us. I pray that wherever we don't sense that awe, that you will remind us of your greatness. Lord, help us never to become so familiar with you that we just take you for granted. We know that you are God, even though you are our Father. I just pray right now that as you have revealed to Daniel what is to take place, that it would be a word of encouragement and strength to us to know that whatever we face, both individually, as a church, as a community of believers around the world, that you are watching over your people, and we know that you will win the victory. Help us to know that you hear us in prayer. Lord, respond to us in prayer. Continue to show us your presence and be with us, that we may be strong and courageous. And as the angel said to Daniel, to be at peace. We pray you give us that peace today. We love you and praise you and ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen.